The Corinthians were a group of people that Paul had started a church among. 1 Corinthians is the first letter that he wrote to them. And he dealt with some very specific issues in that letter because they were real people with real issues in a real church in a real place. Because they're real people with real issues, they're a lot like us. And we can identify with them and relate to them because they experience many of the exact same things that you're experiencing today in this world. Because they're real people and not merely an example or characters in an allegory, that means that there are probably some aspects of their makeup, their church, that you don't as easily identify with. They weren't scripted to look like us. They were just broken people like us. And so the subject matter in the passage that we'll look at today, it may not apply directly to you, but it's important because it applies directly to someone here today. Today we're going to be talking about what Paul had to say to those that were married to unbelieving spouses. And if that's not the situation that you find yourself in because your spouse is a believer, is actively following Jesus, then you need to hear this message because you'll know how to best pray for those in our congregation that this speaks directly to. And you'll also see, as Paul speaks to them, the importance, the influence that God has given to husbands and fathers. You're here this morning and you're not married. You're single. You're young and marriage is far off into the future. I hope that you hear the difficulty and the heartache that can come from being in a relationship with someone who does not hold the values that you hold and doesn't believe in the God that you believe in. Let's look at this passage, 1 Corinthians chapter 7, verse 10. And unto the married I command, yet not I, but the Lord. Let not the wife depart from her husband. But and if she depart, let her remain unmarried, or be reconciled to her husband, and let not the husband put away his wife. But to the rest speak I, not the Lord. If any brother hath a wife that believeth not, and she be pleased to dwell with him, let him not put her away. And the woman which hath a husband that believeth not, if he be pleased to dwell with her, let her not leave him. Real important phrase in both of those verses, as Paul directs it at husbands and wives. He says, if they be pleased to dwell. Pleased to dwell. For the unbelieving husband is sanctified by the wife, and the unbelieving wife is sanctified by the husband. Else were your children unclean, but now they are holy. But if the unbelieving depart, let him depart. And a brother or a sister is not under bondage in such cases, but God hath called us to peace. For what knowest thou, O wife, whether thou shalt save thy husband? Or how knowest thou, O man, whether thou shalt save thy wife? Are you familiar with a loophole? A loophole is an exception or some gap in the law, some area that the law has not adequately covered that you can take advantage of, that corporations and people take advantage of all of the time for their own benefit. In 1999, David Phillips, who was an engineer in California, read on the box of his Healthy Choice frozen dinner that they were doing a promotion, and that if you sent in 10 barcodes from a Healthy Choice food product, they would give you 1,000 frequent flyer miles in return. Frequent flyer miles, if you add them up, you can buy a free ticket. He figured out the math and he realized that 1,000 miles wasn't that great of a deal in return for 10 Healthy Choice frozen dinners, because that would add up pretty quickly. But there was a barcode on each Healthy Choice individual pudding, and that was pretty cheap. So he got his van and he went all around town buying as many Healthy Choice pudding packs as he possibly could. Now, it was in 1999, so people were kind of like, why are you buying so much pudding? And he just said, I'm preparing for Y2K. In the end, he bought 12,150 packs of pudding. And he cashed them in, and they had to give him 1.25 million frequent flyer miles. On top of that, he took all of the pudding to the local Salvation Army and donated them to them if they would merely peel off the barcodes and give them back to him. So he took $800 of a donation to the Salvation Army off of his taxes that year. He and his family have been flying for free for years. He found a loophole. He took advantage of it. He leveraged it for his own benefit. I got to admit, I kind of look at him and say, I give you props, man. It's pretty clever. But what Paul is talking about here in this passage of Scripture is he's making it clear to them that they cannot leverage a loophole in God's Word or God's commands to try to get away with sin. The bottom line of this passage is you will not get away with sin on a technicality. You will not get away with sin on a technicality. Now, occasionally, someone gets away with crime because of some flaw in the court system. They get away with it on a technicality. And that doesn't demonstrate their innocence. It just demonstrates the imperfection of the court system. But I want you to realize this morning that the court that we will answer to one day, the court where the Lord will judge our lives, our actions in this life, it is perfect. It is without any imperfection. There will be no getting away with your sin because of a technicality. You will not walk into the judge's courtroom in heaven and outsmart God. And I shouldn't need to say that, but the truth is that I do need to say it. Because some of you are so proud of yourselves, you've wiggled your way out of so many jams that you think that maybe one day you'll be able to wiggle yourself out of the condemnation for your sin. It's not going to happen. You're not going to get away with your sin on a technicality. That's what he's dealing with here. So let's jump into it. He tells them a divorce does not justify adultery. God's desire is for every marriage to endure, and He established marriage to be a lifelong commitment. The vows of marriage are to be faithful to one another for the rest of your lives. And if you break that vow and divorce your spouse, God holds you accountable for that. You see what they were doing? And if you remember all the things that he's been talking about in chapter 6 leading up to this point about sexual immorality, about going to prostitutes, there were some who had taken Paul's commands and used it as a loophole. Paul said, we're free from the law. I can do whatever I want, including going to prostitutes. He had to straighten them out on that. Some said, Paul said sex is a sin. Immorality is a sin. I don't have to have sex with my spouse because Paul said it's bad. Paul says, that's not what I said. Let me straighten you out. So he's dealt with those two extremes. But now he has to deal with a group of people who say, okay, we're only supposed to have sex with our spouse. I hear you, Paul. I'm going to divorce her and marry her, and then I'll have sex with her, and it'll be all right, God. Right? It'll be cool. Because I'm no longer married to her, and now I'm married to her. So Paul has to say in this passage, if you divorce, then don't remarry. Because you're not going to find a way to do it with God's approval. You're not going to get away with that. They were attempting to use divorce and remarriage as a cover for their desire to have sex with other people. Paul said, no, it doesn't work that way. I'm sorry. That's not how it works. Now, that's not the entire command, but we're going to get to the rest of it in a moment. But what the problem here was not their understanding of the law or the command. The problem here was their heart. Because in their heart, they were saying, what can we get away with? What are we allowed to do? I had a friend, he knew a highway patrolman. And he asked the highway patrolman, how fast can I go over the speed limit before you pull me over? That's our nature, right? Tell me where the real line is so I can go right up to it and not cross it. Kids do this all the time. Haven, go to your room. She goes to her room and she looks out the door, watching TV down the hallway. Shut the door. Sticking her fingers underneath the crack in the door, Just pushing that envelope however she can. That's us. Well, if I do it this way, it's okay. If I go around this avenue, if I do these things first, then what's God going to say because I've did all the things that He asked me to do? God knows your heart. And that's the issue here. In chapter 6, Paul explained to them, you don't have a clear understanding of the sacrifice that Jesus made for you. If you're wanting to live your life in sin, you clearly don't understand how much it cost Him on the cross. You've lost perspective of the cost of your sin. If you had a real grasp on the sacrifice that Jesus made for you, instead of saying, what can I get away with? You'd be saying, what can I do for you, Lord? What can I do to serve you, Jesus? How can I avoid any sin in my life? How can I stay away from anything that's going to taint my life and wreck my life like sin does? If our hearts are in the right place, we don't ask what we can get away with. He says a divorce is not going to justify your adultery. And he also tells them unbelief does not justify your divorce. Paul makes it quite clear that an unbelieving spouse is not grounds enough for divorce. The fact that your spouse doesn't believe in and of itself does not give you justification for leaving him or her. In fact, the exact opposite ought to be true. If there are two unbelievers in a marriage and one of them becomes a believer, that person should be graced with God's power, His Spirit, His joy, His salvation, His endurance. That person should be better able to endure in a marriage that is broken than two unbelievers would. Obviously, there are going to be issues that arise with one spouse being a believer and one not. And Paul talks about that in 2 Corinthians chapter 6, where he refers to it as being unequally yoked. And unequally yoked means when you would take a team of oxen, you'd yoke them together to pull some cart or to pull a plow. If they're unequally yoked, it's going to cause them to pull in opposition to one another. One's going to be pulling to the left and the other one's going to be pulling in the right. They're not going to be pulling in the same direction. Or one ox is going to be carrying all of the burden while the other just walks alongside the one who's struggling. And if you're in a marriage where one spouse is a believer and the other is not, you can feel how fitting that analogy is. Because you can feel how your marriage often tests your faith and your faith often tests your marriage. How you often feel as if you are carrying all of the load and the other person is not doing anything, not carrying anything. Paul says, don't be unequally yoked. It's going to be difficult. It's going to be hard. But that difficulty and that hardship is not a justification to get a divorce. When the grace of God comes into your life, it should better enable you to live in that difficult situation, in that difficult marriage. When you have the grace of God, the joy of the Lord, the encouragement of a strong church family, you'll be able to continue on when other people would have said, I quit. And I'm just going to be honest and transparent with you for a moment. There have been situations where I have counseled and I've tried to be a help in these situations, and the unbelieving spouse tries to blame the church or to blame the Lord or to blame the faith for the problems in the marriage. And I just want to say, if only you realize that if it wasn't for the grace of God and the joy of the Lord, he or she would have left you years ago. It's only because of the grace of God that you're not out on your own. The grace of God has empowered that believing spouse to stick with you. He tells them a divorce does not justify adultery. Unbelief does not justify divorce. And he says belief should lead toward redemption. Now understand where Paul is coming from when in verse 15 he says the believing spouse sanctifies the unbelieving spouse. In chapter 6, when he has told them they shouldn't be going to prostitutes, he says, if you're a believer, Christ is a part of your life, He is joined to you, and you go to a prostitute. That is the act of two becoming one, and you are joining Christ to a prostitute, which is highly inappropriate. He doesn't want them to then use that argument and say, well, if I'm a believer and my spouse isn't a believer, then I shouldn't have any sexual relations with them because then I'm joining Christ to an unbeliever. Paul says the believing spouse consecrates that marriage so that is not a valid argument for you to use. So he's saying the believing spouse consecrates that marriage, brings grace into that home, brings grace to that family and to those children, and should lead the family towards redemption. Paul goes even further and says, who yet knows? Perhaps the husband will save the unbelieving wife through their example, or the wife will save the husband through his believing example. What better opportunity is there than for a person to carry the gospel of Jesus Christ into their home around an unbelieving person? We work hard to bring unbelievers in contact with the gospel. I don't need any greater demonstration than this set behind me that we have for Vacation Bible School. As you walk through the hall, you saw we have invested major effort and time into this upcoming week to bring children from this community into our church to share the gospel with them. We are going to work hard to get as many of those families to join us next Sunday for the VBS Sunday. We're going to work hard to get them here for 1 hour to live out the gospel in front of them, preach the gospel message. Hopefully they'll stick around for some lunch and be around some of you so that they'll have some influence toward the gospel of Jesus Christ. We're going to put an incredible amount of effort in this week and that next Sunday. How much greater would it be if we could send the gospel home with them? And if you are here today and you are a believer, but your spouse does not believe, or your children do not believe, you're here and you still live at home with your parents and they do not believe, you have the opportunity to carry the gospel message into that home every week, every day. And may God help you to live out the gospel in front of them. Paul's desire was that they would carry that gospel back home, that they would love their spouses, they would be faithful to their spouses, they would stay committed to their spouses, and that the gospel of Jesus Christ would make an impact in that home. Paul believed that if they were living out the gospel of Jesus Christ, it would make a difference in that home. And he says, I can't promise you that they're going to change. I can't promise you that they're going to give their lives to the Lord, but you don't know. Perhaps you will save your husband, your wife. Paul was so optimistic about this. When he was in Philippi, he was arrested and put in jail. God brought about a miracle so that he would be released from that jail in an earthquake. The bars of the walls fell down. The Philippian jailer was convinced he was going to be held accountable for everyone escaping, was about to take his life. Paul, instead of running out of the jail, instead of taking that moment to get his freedom, he stopped and he said, please don't harm yourself. Don't hurt yourself. Don't kill yourself. The Philippian jailer was so moved by Paul's act of unselfishness. Instead of taking that moment to flee for his own safety, he was caring about someone else. That's a perfect picture of the gospel. And the Philippian jailer said in response to Paul, what must I do to have what you have? What must I do to be saved? And Paul's response to him was this: believe on the Lord Jesus Christ and you will be saved and your house. Now, Paul was not saying that the jailer's confessing of his sin caused forgiveness of his wife and his children's sin, but Paul was convinced that through the leadership of that man, that the family would come to know the Lord and it would make a difference in that family. And you know what? This bears out that when dad loves the Lord and is active in church, the chances of the children loving the Lord and being active in church are 33% higher than if it's just mom by herself. Those are the statistics. Dad, if you're in church, 33% more likely your children are going to be in church. Now, there's a lot of things that you want to hand down to your kids. You probably want to build a nice life for them. You want to hand down something that mattered. The greatest thing that you can do is hand down some godly values. Some of you are upset with the state of our country today. You're upset with the state of the generation that is coming up. Who raised them? Who handed them values? The greatest thing that you could give them is not an inheritance. It's not a job at your business. It's not your old pickup truck. It's not your hard work ethic. It's a relationship with Jesus Christ, and all of the rest will follow after that. It's the most important thing. And it breaks my heart. It breaks my heart that some of you are working your fingers to the bone to build houses and buy cars that will matter nothing to your children one day. And they will get those things and sell them off, and they will not know the man that bought them. And they will not share his values or his principles, if you're lucky. Some of you don't want your kids to live like you lived. Paul said, call upon the name of the Lord and you will be saved, and your house. Paul recognized that when grace is active in the home, when the gospel is lived out in the home, that it makes a difference in the family. Peter said in Acts 2:39, do you remember that message from the very beginning of the year, our vision for the future? He said, this promise, the gospel, is unto you and your children. The message that I preach to you today is not just for today, it is for your children and your grandchildren. And Dad, more than anyone else, they're looking at you. Daniel Voss is a Free Will Baptist pastor in Arizona. He was recently sharing about how their church makes it their mission, their focus, to reach young men, because they know if they reach dad and husband, they reach the family. He said as he was standing on the stage one Sunday morning, it was a little bit different of a message. It was a message where he shared a point and then they led a song that corresponded to that point. He led a second point, then they had a second song that corresponded. Then he did the third point and they did a third song. He said during the first point he can see this husband, wife, and their 15 to 16-year-old son sitting together in the congregation. During the first song, she's singing her heart out, and Dad is standing there like this with his hands crossed. And right next to him, 15, 16-year-old Junior is standing there exactly like his dad. He preached the second point. They led in the second song. He looks out. Mom is worshiping with their hands lifted, heart broken, singing at the top of her lungs. Dad has uncrossed his arms and he's put his hands in his pockets. And he's mumbling a little bit. He's moving his lips. Preaches the third point. They come up with the third song. They get to the chorus, the final chorus of that third song. Mom is worshiping the Lord with all that she has. And Dad is not only singing, but he lifts his hands, worshiping God. And Daniel said immediately that 16-year-old son lifted his hands as well. Because soon as the example was set for him by his father, he followed suit. Dad, God has honored you with an incredible amount of influence in your home. He has given you something that no one else has. No teacher, no friend, no one has the influence that you have. That's a heavy responsibility and a great privilege that God has given you. Paul says, lead with grace in your home. Lead with grace in your home so that the other spouse may come to know the truth, so the children of that home come to know the gospel. He told him a divorce doesn't justify adultery. Unbelief doesn't justify a divorce. And belief should lead towards repentance. But he closes with, redemption requires willing hearts. What is it that he says in the final verse? He says there in verse 15, but if the unbelieving spouse departs, or they are not pleased for the believing spouse to dwell with them, that believer is not bound to them, they are free. Some really important phrases that Paul uses here. If the unbelieving spouse is pleased to dwell with her, pleased to dwell with him. Paul's not saying, hey, listen, if you're married to an unsaved guy who beats you, sorry, you got to stick around. He's not saying, hey, if you're married to an unsaved woman who takes advantage of you and cheats on you, you're stuck with him. No, but he does say, if you'll lead with grace, and they're pleased to live with you, to dwell with you, to be married to you, perhaps God will work in a great way in their heart through your example. But it's going to take a willing heart. Dad, it's going to take a willing heart. Mom, it's going to take a willing heart. Redemption requires a willing heart. If the unbelieving spouse remains unmoved, remains stubborn, remains angry, remains bitter, continues to push the believer away, leaves them, they're no longer bound to them. You see, there's a major difference between someone who divorces their spouse because they have their eye on someone and someone who is no longer with their spouse, who has broken them and walked away from them. Paul said, the reason that we have these commands about divorce is because we don't want you divorcing someone just to remarry the person that you've got your eye on currently. You remember we did the Finding Your Way Back to God series? I told you about the man who's been married 47 times. His longest marriage was something like 3 years. His shortest one was like 12 hours. Do you remember the detail about his life that I shared with you, what he did for a living? He was a pastor, supposedly. You know the reason that he had so many marriages? He thought that he could do what he wanted as long as he got married first. Some marriage commitment, some document, that's not going to cover up your broken heart, your sinful heart, your lustful eye. That's what Paul was getting at. But a heart that is willing can be redeemed. And a marriage made up of willing people can be redeemed. And a family of willing hearts can be redeemed. Most of what I know about Vacation Bible School, I learned in Greeley, Colorado. In between my sophomore and junior year, I went to Greeley to do an internship with Mark Thomas. He ran a Vacation Bible School unlike any I'd seen. They did a VBS store. They encouraged the parents to come, not on Friday, not on Sunday evening, but Sunday morning so they could have them there in the worship service. We have built our Vacation Bible School off of that model. When I was in Greeley, I stayed with a couple, Ray and Alice Ann Larson. They lived really close to the church, lived in a beautiful home. He drove a restored Corvette, worked at Kodak, had a great job as an engineer at Kodak. He and Alice Ann had been married for several years, and the marriage was falling apart. They decided to have an amicable divorce and had a lawyer draw up the papers. The papers were sitting on their kitchen table, ready for both of them to sign. They'd been sleeping in different bedrooms. They were going to be headed to separate directions. They'd split their assets. They got a postcard from the Free Will Baptist Church 2 blocks away about Vacation Bible School, and that after Vacation Bible School there would be a series on God's hope for the family. And on a whim, they decided to go to the Baptist church at the end of the road that day. They didn't have kids. They had grown children, but no children at home. They didn't have any children in VBS. They came and they listened to the message. And after the service, as they were walking out to the car, Ray said, I looked at Alice Ann and I said, I don't know about you, but that hit me right between the eyes. They left the divorce papers on the kitchen table. came back to church. They had willing hearts, and God redeemed them. And they were a joy to stay with for 10 weeks that summer because they loved one another. And there was joy in that home. Their marriage was redeemed because there were willing hearts. Whatever your situation is this morning, no matter your brokenness, no matter the degree of the problems in your relationship, if you have a willing heart, Christ can redeem that situation. Let's bow our heads for a word of prayer.